Writing the first draft of a paper is a little like finishing a first coat of paint. It may seem like you've covered everything, but when you step away to look at the finished product, you can see how uneven your work really is. As with the primer coat, a first draft leaves several bare spots and rough areas which need touching up and more work. That's why revising and editing a paper are necessary. This is the finishing process, the second coat and the sanding, that makes the paper read more smoothly and coherently. Revising a paper entails looking at the bigger picture. How well do your ideas flow from one to another? How well have you stated your case? The word revise means literally to re-see or see again. Just as painters survey their work to determine where the rough spots are, you need to pull back from your first draft and examine it with the same critical eye. At this point, you should not be concerned about correcting mistakes in grammar or spelling or sentence structure. That will occur in the next step, in the editing process. For now, consider the second draft, the revision stage, as the step where you try to look objectively at the content of your paper, as if you were someone else reading it for the first time. For now, we will concentrate only on the process of revision. When you read your paper through for revisions, you will want to see, most of all, if it makes sense. Can you follow the line of reasoning the paper takes, or does the reasoning get confused and bogged down in so many minor details that the meaning gets lost? Is there any material that does not advance the purpose of the paper? Can each conclusion be logically drawn from the facts that preceded? As you learned in introductory writing, the body paragraphs of your essay are comprised of a topic sentence and several supporting sentences which develop that point. The topic sentence does not need to be the first sentence of the paragraph, but all the sentences of that paragraph should revolve around the topic sentence. They either lead up to it or support the point it asserts. As you read through your paper, check to be sure each paragraph remains true to the topic sentence and stays to the point. Consider the following paragraph.
One group which researchers believe will be greatly responsible for spreading the AIDS virus is teenagers. One reason for this is that adolescents often do not feel their own mortality and therefore take greater chances. Many students in last year's graduating class were known to flirt with death on several occasions. Some experimented with different combinations of drugs and drove recklessly. Last year, more high school seniors died in car wrecks than any other graduating class had in previous years.
What's wrong with this paragraph? Well, the beginning of it starts out fine. It states a fact. Researchers believe one group likely to spread AIDS is teenagers. The second sentence is fine also. The statement flows logically from the topic sentence because it states a reason why researchers believe teens are a high-risk group. But then the writer goes off on a tangent. What does getting high or driving recklessly have to do with AIDS? By the last sentence in the paragraph, we're off talking about people dying in traffic accidents, and there's absolutely no connection between traffic deaths and AIDS. The paper might be about drugs and driving at this point. It's easy to see how this person got off the main point. The writer used an example to illustrate the point that teenagers may take more risks than other age groups. But the example wasn't related to the subject at hand. Instead of talking about teenagers and risk-taking, the writer strayed and began to talk about drugs. If you feel you need to prove a point, be sure to stay with your subject and try not to use any unrelated illustrations. It's often helpful to ask yourself questions about the topic. In this example, you could ask questions like, why would teenagers spread AIDS? In what ways would they spread the disease? And to what extent? With answers to these questions, you can revise the last two sentences and establish a more logical flow of ideas. Instead of the last two sentences, you could say,
many students express the belief that it can't happen to me when they talk about dying from AIDS. They mistakenly think that because they're not homosexual and they do not associate with gay or bisexual partners, they can't get AIDS.
Now we have a paragraph that stays on track, adds to the topic sentence, and gives us even more insight into the problem being discussed. And with a revised version of the paragraph, You can see that it will be a lot easier for the writer to move on to the next thought from here. The writer of the original version might have had trouble getting back to the subject of AIDS after talking about car accidents. So as you read through your paper, be on the lookout for places where you may have gotten off the subject or where you lost the logical flow of ideas. By asking yourself the basic questions of why, how, and to what extent, you can see if your body sentences support your topic sentence. A second problem to look for in your writing is holes. Are there points you've raised that need more elaboration or support? Here's an example.
Airline executives say they have statistics to prove that air travel is safer today than it was 10 years ago. Despite this, there have been 5 major accidents in the past 2 years.
The problem with this paragraph is the writer failed to include the actual statistics or findings which back the airline's claims. Without these numbers, how can the reader evaluate the second sentence? Again, ask and answer some simple questions. About how many accidents have occurred in recent years? 5 crashes may seem like a lot, but it may also be a small number when compared to the number of crashes that occurred in the early 80s. The writer needs to elaborate on that point in order to help prove the argument.
Airline executives say that air travel is safer today than it was 10 years ago. They base this on a study which indicates that plane crashes occurred on an average of 3 a year in the early 80s, whereas only 1 occurs each year on the average today. Regardless of these claims, air travel has not necessarily improved. There have been 5 major accidents in the past 2 years.
A third factor to consider in your writing is slant versus bias. Slant is a way of looking at something from a particular angle. It's the point of view of the writer. For example, there are several ways you can look at this scene. You can see a wide angle which encompasses everything, but people and objects can't be seen in great detail. You can look close up at various elements in the shot, but from this perspective, you can't see the context. Where is this person standing? What are they doing? Or you can look at the scene from an emotional perspective. All writers have a point of view. It's what gives the writing its style and flair. A slant makes writing more lively and imaginative, rather than sounding bland and machine-like. It would be horrible if all writing sounded flat and non-evaluative like this.
The next stop is Concourse B. The color-coded maps and signs in this vehicle match the station.
The same is true for writing a thesis. For example, fall is close, and that means football season is about to begin. Not very interesting, is it? But what about football season is about to begin, and that means many high school boys will be needlessly, often tragically injured. Now we're getting somewhere. This is a strong claim. It makes a point. So writing with a slant or point of view is not bad. Writing a biased paper, however, is. A bias is a prejudice which ignores the facts or contradictory evidence and makes a judgment based on emotion. While writing with a slant involves describing events or people through a filtered lens, slanted writing is descriptive rather than evaluative. Biased writing does not belong in a research paper. Writing with a point of view does. Let's look at examples of both. Then we can better see how to spot and avoid bias, as well as how to liven up our writing with more colorful descriptions. Here are 2 sentences. As you listen to them, try to decide which one is biased and which is written with a slant.
He blew up like a sudden rainstorm that came without warning. Then, as suddenly, he smiled as if the clouds had parted. Or, he was a disgusting man with an unpredictable temper, and he had no right to have children.
Which sentence is biased? Clearly, it is the second of the 2. The writer made a judgment about the person he was describing, that he was disgusting and had no right to have children. This is an opinion which can't be proved or disproved, even though others might agree with the judgment. The first sentence, however, describes the situation by letting the reader see the unpredictability of the man's temper. The sentence describes how the man's temper can come and go without warning or provocation. Readers are free to draw their own conclusions about what kind of person this man is. Sometimes, in order to avoid bias in our writing, we may bend over backwards and write very straightforward but non-descriptive sentences. The result is oatmeal. Here's an example.
Music known as heavy metal is often performed by people who wear face makeup, dress in costumes, and shout rather than sing.
Does that sentence accurately call up the kinds of images you see here? From the way the sentence describes heavy metal, you might have just as easily imagined this. Remember that your job as a writer is to help the reader imagine what you see with words. So descriptive adjectives and imagery are important to everything you write, even to a research paper. As you read through your first draft, check to see if you've been precise and detailed enough in your descriptions. If you have not, you will need to rework those sentences until they more accurately portray the images or concepts you're describing.
Performances of heavy metal music often contain demonic overtones, from the satanic black costumes and black fingernails of the musicians to the larger-than-life backdrops which pulsate with strobe lights and seethe with smoke.
The descriptive words in this piece conjure up very vivid imagery for the reader. Another aspect to check for is the accuracy of your facts. As you read through your first draft, it is not unusual to discover contradictions. For example, the student writing about a famous painter may discover one paragraph that stresses the artist's reliance on imagination to paint, while another part of the paper talks about the artist's use of real-life models. This apparent contradiction could confuse the reader, and such problems need to be resolved in the rewrite phase. Go back through your notes. Did you get the artist mixed up with a different painter? If not, how do your sources explain the contradiction? Your rewrite needs to at least acknowledge the problem so it doesn't appear as if you ignored your own earlier statements. Although Degas primarily painted from imagination, he occasionally relied on real models. Finally, in the second draft of your paper, you should concentrate on polishing and reworking the introduction and conclusion. First, check to be sure your thesis, as stated in the introduction, relates to the body of your paper. The same holds true for the conclusion. Does it relate to the thesis? Once you've determined this, you'll want to take those two paragraphs and develop them beyond mere statements of intent or summation. The introduction and conclusion are the two most important paragraphs of your paper. The introduction sets the tone and leads your readers into the subject and to the point you want to make. The conclusion leaves your readers with that lasting impression they will walk away with. Therefore, it is important that you give special attention to the introduction and the conclusion in the rewrite phase to breathe more life into them. You may not realize it, but every TV program you watch, every news story you see, and every newspaper or magazine article you read has an introduction which is designed to lure you into the story.
Specifically, you owe the United States government, in round numbers, $50,000.
Even murder mysteries start out with an introductory scene to help you understand who's been killed or what mystery needs to be solved.
Tell the king's fortune.
Not mine. Let's hear Prince Stefan's.
Afraid of your future, cousin?
I'll tell you that when I've heard yours.
Don't worry, Conrad. I'm going to have a long, peaceful life. Tell them, girl.
Without the introduction, the viewer has no idea what the program is about. The introduction helps the viewer decide to stay tuned or switch channels. Likewise, the first few paragraphs in a newspaper or magazine article either grabs the reader's interest or makes them move on to another story. So your challenge in rewriting your introduction is to present the thesis of your paper in an appealing or intriguing manner, which will bait the reader to continue on. The main purpose of the introductory paragraph, then, is to lead your reader into the subject. There are a number of ways to open an essay. The most common techniques are to start with an anecdote, present some startling facts, use sharp contrast, or relate historical background on the subject. Let's look at each of these. When you start with an anecdote or story, you are beginning with a specific example of the point you are making and working backwards to a more general statement. For example,
Anna Davis, a widow of modest means, retired in 1966. After several years of good health, she was hospitalized with a case of pneumonia. With the help of recently developed techniques for dealing with respiratory failure, Mrs. Davis soon recovered and returned to her active lifestyle. 4 years later, at the age of 71, outpatient surgery successfully restored Mrs. Davis's eyesight, which had become impaired due to cataracts. By the age of 75, degenerative arthritis made it difficult for Mrs. Davis to get around. Hip replacement surgery gave her a new lease on an active life. At the age of 82, a severe stroke forced Mrs. Davis to enter a nursing home. 2 years later, she suffered a heart attack and was placed on life support systems. Anna Davis died 9 days later at the age of 84.
a second way to start your essay is to open with startling facts or statistics.
In 1986, the United States ran up a $60 billion trade deficit with Japan. This means that we imported $60 billion more in goods from Japan than we exported to that country.
Opening your essay with sharp contrasts is another suggested method.
Back in the 1960s, only a handful of cars purchased in the United States were built by foreign automakers. Today, there seem to be as many Toyotas and Hondas on American roads as Fords and Chevrolets.
Finally, you may want to introduce your reader to the subject by presenting some historical information.
In the 1970s, first under President Nixon, then under Presidents Ford and Carter, the two superpowers were talking to each other in earnest, and they succeeded in signing a number of important treaties and trade agreements. But after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, relations between the two nations soured.
One of the most common pitfalls encountered in writing an introduction is to get too cute or too gimmicky. For example,
cough, cough, cough. Don't you hate rude cigarette smokers?
Another pitfall is taking forever to get to your point or backing into your thesis. This is especially true of essays that begin with anecdotes. Remember that an anecdote is only intended to set up your main point. You don't need to give every last detail of the story. By the same token, you want to avoid shortcutting the introduction too much. Sometimes, in an effort to get straight to the point, you might race through your opening and not really warm up your reader to the topic. For example,
many Americans smoke. Smoking is rude. Smoking should be prohibited in every building in the country.
There are a few other turnoffs to avoid. Try not to repeat your assignment in the opening of your paper, such as, "I have been asked to write about," or "this paper will discuss." Also, avoid using the title of your paper as if it were the opening sentence. For example,
rude smokers. These people should not be allowed to invade the airspace of others.
Try not to make apologetic introductions. Avoid phrases such as, "Some people may not agree with me, but," or "even though it is difficult to fully understand so-and-so's works." Statements such as these undercut your own credibility in discussing the subject at hand. Finally, avoid sounding indecisive if writing about contradictory or controversial material.
Tough environmental laws are the only way to get rid of acid air. On the other hand, industry shouldn't have to comply with strict, costly laws.
If the introduction is important in getting your audience to read your essay, the conclusion is important in helping your readers crystallize their thoughts on the subject and digest what they've read. Like the period at the end of a sentence, the concluding paragraph brings the reader to a logical stopping place or conclusion. There are 4 common techniques frequently used in writing a conclusion. The first is to restate the thesis of your paper. This doesn't mean you do it in a mechanical, repetitive way. You do not want to say, "Thus I have shown that," or, "As stated in the beginning." Try instead to reiterate the thesis with a fresh, even imaginative perspective. If you have opened your paper with an anecdote, you may consider ending your paper with the cyclical approach. That is, by returning to that anecdote and tying it in with the ending. For example,
Mrs. Davis's story is a reminder of how much has changed over the past generation, both in medical science and in our expectations of old age. Mrs. Davis was also part of the first generation of Americans that could count on public programs to pay a substantial part of their medical expenses. Prior to that, millions of older Americans were just one hospital stay away from poverty.
if your paper has presented a problem to the reader, you may want to conclude by suggesting a course of action.
The history of how nations have responded to epidemics suggests that fear and blame can tear a community apart. So a final question here is whether we can find a way to discuss the public response to AIDS in a way that enhances a sense of community rather than destroying it. In the words of one physician, with so many lives hanging in the balance, differences must be set aside for the greater good.
Or you might end your paper with a prediction based on the information in the essay.
To make America more competitive, do we need new trade policies, better economic planning, or a more personal commitment to quality? Who do we feel can best manage our economy, businessmen or government officials? And what do we value most, hard work or more leisure? One thing is certain, answers to these questions are urgently needed, because if America continues to lose its competitive edge, it will mean fewer jobs, shrinking incomes, and a declining standard of living for almost all of us.
There's some common pitfalls to avoid in writing the conclusion. First, you do not want to introduce any new information at the very end, such as suddenly starting to talk about lung cancer after you've written an entire paper about outlawing smoking in public places. Starting a new subject at the end is like a roller coaster which has slowed down and is heading back to the station, suddenly speeding up again and heading up another hill. Be sure your conclusion concludes. It signals the end of the point you were making. However, you don't want to simply cut things off abruptly. After a 3-page essay on smoking, you can't simply conclude with, "And that's why I dislike smoking." That would be like a conductor pulling the switch on a train at 120 miles per hour. The converse is also true. Don't take forever to end. You know the problem of trying to get off the phone with someone who keeps going on and on and on. You want to shout, "Enough already." Don't make your readers feel the same way. And ending with a showy finale is not always desirable or preferable. Avoid being too cute or corny or clever in the end, such as in this case, in which the writer has been discussing the damaging effects of chemical hair treatments like bleaching and permanent waves.
So the moral of the story is, hair today, gone tomorrow.
Once you're satisfied with your concluding paragraph, you've completed the process of revision. You've read through the paper for its overall coherence, checked for factual accuracy, punched up descriptions, deleted any biased statements, and finally, you've written a strong introduction and conclusion. Your second draft is now complete, and you're ready to move on to the last step in the writing process, editing.
Slant versus bias. An important revision consideration is whether you have taken a slant or a position in your paper, which provides your reader with a point of view and adds interest and flair to your writing. Consider the following example. At the end of every semester, students frantically seek new housing situations. In this example, the writer has stated a fact, but takes no stance regarding this issue. The revised statement is written with a slant. City developers should consider building more student apartments because at the end of every semester, students frantically seek new housing situations. This statement adds interest and provides a direction in which to develop further ideas. Readers can expect to hear more about the housing shortage. Bias. Taking too strong a stance based on your own emotions can cause problems in a paper. A writer who seeks to advance strong opinions without regard to contradictory facts or arguments uses bias, something which does not belong in academic writing. A biased version of the above statement might read something like this. If the backward developers in this city would wise up, they would build more apartments for the greedy students who don't appreciate the comfortable dormitories on campus. Words such as backward, greedy, and comfortable are evaluative rather than descriptive. They lack the sophistication necessary to convey a controversial position. In an effort to avoid bias, some writers revert to dry, non-committal writing. Remember, your job as a writer is to help the reader imagine what you see. Examine the following sentence. Books line up on a shelf like a stand of pines, each connected to others by kind, yet strangers to one another too. Notice how the writer presents a picture. He or she compares the books to a stand of pines and gives the books a human quality by calling them strangers. These are just two ways to enliven your writing. Carefully choosing adjectives, adverbs, and active verbs which appeal to the senses are other ways to add zest to your prose.